Hello everybody and welcome to the fifth and final video in our short series of videos on the Cold War. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes. So by the end of this presentation, you guys should know how the arms race developed. You guys should know what the terms Detente, Glasnost and Perestroika were. And finally, you guys should know how the USSR came to an end as a state. So we have looked at some of the biggest events of the Cold War when we discussed the Berlin blockade, the Korean War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've also looked at the US policy of containment to stop the spread of communism through actions like the implementation of the Truman Doctrine, Marshall Aid, and the disastrous Vietnam War. We also looked at Soviet attempts at keeping communism strong by putting down popular uprisings like in the Hungarian Uprising in 1956 and the Prague Spring of 1968, as well as the Brezhnev Doctrine which followed that. Today we are going to look at the arms race and how the Cold War came to an end. So after the US dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima at the end of World War II, it made the stakes in the arms race that was to develop between the two superpowers even higher. The US continued to develop atomic bombs to try to discourage communist expansion, but then in 1949 the Soviets developed their own atomic bomb, essentially starting the arms race. The US formed NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949, which was a military alliance with the countries of Western Europe and Canada. And in response to this, the USSR formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955. This was specifically after West Germany joined NATO. And as we know, Hitler had tried to keep West Germany and Germany as weak as possible. The more destructive hydrogen bomb was developed in 1952 by the USA, and it was replicated by the USSR the following year in 1953. And by 1957, both countries had developed ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles, which allowed them to fire these dangerous bombs from over 5,500 kilometers away from their target. Paranoia grew over the size of the other country's arsenal, with many in the US believing a well-promoted theory called the missile gap, in which they thought the Soviet Union had better missile capabilities. This was eventually disproven by the CIA, but it didn't stop the stockpiling of weapons, with both countries developing well over 10,000 of these destructive weapons. As we saw with the Cuban Missile Crisis, all-out nuclear war nearly occurred. With tensions so high, a change had to come. A partial test ban treaty was agreed after the Cuban Missile Crisis, where both countries agreed to stop testing nuclear weapons on land or on sea. In the 1970s, the US and the USSR entered a period known as Detente, which means kind of like an easing of hostility or of strained relations. US President Richard Nixon and Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev wanted to cooperate to reduce this tension. In 1972, they signed the SALT I agreement, which is the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, basically looking to develop a type of arms control. They agreed to limit the number of nuclear missiles which each country could develop. Cooperation and negotiations continued, with the attempt to sign another deal called SALT II, which would enforce even greater arms control. However, in 1979, the USSR invaded Afghanistan, with President Jimmy Carter of the United States refusing then to sign SALT II. The USSR was supporting the communist government of Afghanistan against the Afghan resistance known as the Mujahideen, who received covert support from the US. This war would be a disaster for the USSR. When Ronald Reagan became president in the United States in 1980, he ended the policy of détente. He believed that the best way to contain Soviet expansion was to gain military superiority by building up even more arms. Attempts at arms control didn't go anywhere, and in 1983, Reagan proposed a project, the SDI, which became nicknamed as Star Wars, where he wanted to build a defensive system in space which used lasers that would destroy Soviet missiles to the USA. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the USSR, and he aimed to improve relations with the United States. In 1987, both sides negotiated the INF Treaty, or the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, where they agreed to get rid of a number of nuclear weapons. Gorbachev came to power with the Soviet economy in turmoil, and the country still involved in the catastrophic Afghan war. He wanted to introduce reforms at home, so he introduced a new policy called Glasnost, or openness, which allowed freedom of speech, and Perestroika, which was an attempt to restructure the Soviet economy. He also informed the communist governments of Eastern Europe that Soviet troops wouldn't be used to defend communism in these countries as it had been before. The USSR had used a policy of martial law in Poland before the rise of Gorbachev in 1981 to destroy an anti-Soviet trade union called Solidarity, who wanted to improve workers' rights and bring in social change. Despite the attempts to suppress it, it continued underground. In 1989, using Gorbachev's Glasnost policy, both Poland and Hungary called for free elections. Solidarity won power in Poland, and Hungary opened its borders to the non-communist country of Austria. East Germans began to flock to Hungary to cross the border into Austria. After East Germany closed the border to Hungary, protests took place calling for free elections and a new government. And finally, when a new government came in, it announced the end of the partition of the city. And on the 9th of November 1989, the Berlin Wall began to be dismantled by the people of Germany. Germany itself was fully reunited in October of 1990. Czechoslovakia, in turn, overthrew its communist government in November of 1989 also. In Romania, communist leader Nicolae Ceausescu refused to give up power and was overthrown in a violent revolt. Bulgarian Communist Party was forced to resign in February of 1990, and Albania removed its Communist Party in 1992. Countries which had been absorbed by the USSR, like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Belarus, demanded independence also. And an attempted coup d'etat in the USSR, where Gorbachev was kidnapped, failed to work. And on Christmas Day in 1991, Gorbachev resigned, giving power to Boris Yeltsin. The next day, the USSR became Russia, bringing an end to communist rule in Russia and an end to the Cold War. There were many factors leading to the end of the Soviet Union. Massive economic problems were at the core of it, which would have been caused by the arms race that really broke them economically. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So by now, you guys should know how the arms race developed. You guys should know what Detente, Glasnost, and Perestroika were. And you guys should know how the USSR came to an end as a state. Thanks for watching. I hope you guys got something good from this video.